Hello everyone, thank you for taking the time to listen to my presentation. My name is Sumana Gupta and I will be discussing the growth and popularity of queer female retellings of Greek mythology. This presentation was inspired by Alcestis by Catherine Buettner, a queer female retelling of Euripides' tragedy of the same name. This novel's poetic prose artfully captures the traditions, customs, and life of ancient Greece, and fleshes out Alcestis' character while still honoring the source material. Despite this praise, I noticed that Buettner's story has received little recognition, especially in contrast to Madeline Miller's retelling of the Iliad, the Song of Achilles, which has received commercial and scholastic acclaim. This presentation will explore the historical roots of how queer male retellings arose, and why queer female retellings did not experience the same growth. The scope for what a queer retelling is quite broad in my presentation. It namely includes stories that strictly retell the story with minor deviations, but may also include stories that are more removed from the original source material and are heavily inspired by Greek mythology. For clarity, this presentation will use the terms queer and homosexual interchangeably, and these terms will be used to describe the sexual relations of two people of the same gender. To discuss the importance of queer retellings, I will first demonstrate the importance of retellings to modern audiences. I will then explore the different social aspects that respectively contributed to the growth of queer male retellings and queer female retellings. As we will see, I will establish that male queer retellings have developed by relying on the abundance of evidence of male homosexuality in classical historical canon. Female queer retellings, in contrast, have developed through the influence of unique expressions of female agency and the evidence of female sexuality in the Greek literature and mythology. Now first, let's answer the question, why do retellings even matter in the first place? Well, retellings matter because it is an opportunity to provide representation to marginalized communities that were omitted or othered in mythological stories. Myths are foundational stories that explore life itself. They are stories that are considered traditional sacred narratives intended to explain the relationship between the entire universe and the human experience. Below are several examples of retellings, all of which tell the stories of different women in mythology. Women are often the focal point for retellings because their existence in the original mythological stories were limited, as it was either within their traditional gender roles, were victimized, or were made antagonists. The importance of these retellings is connected to how our culture values acceptance and equality of all marginalized communities. Natalie Hines, a prolific author of these retellings, encapsulates this importance quite well, as modern audiences have made space in our storytelling to discover women who have been lost or forgotten. They are not villains, victims, wives, and monsters. They are people. The most notable LGBTQ+ retelling of Greek mythology is the Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. This retelling of the Iliad tells the canonical love story of Achilles and Patroclus. The story is told through Patroclus' perspective, a minor character in the Iliad. In the Song of Achilles, Patroclus' main attribute is compassion, and he views the world and the people around him in this way. It is this compassion that the readers are treated to how this Patroclus views Achilles. In Miller's story, Achilles is more than just his rage. Of course, he canonically and romantically loves Patroclus, but he also enjoys playing music, he enjoys juggling, and he is a kind person. There is more to his character than just anger, and the addition of these qualities makes for a more nuanced and complex version of the character. Miller has spoken that she wanted to explore the relationship that sparked Achilles' rage. We will probably never reach a consensus over whether Patroclus and Achilles were queer in the Iliad itself, but we have always agreed that regardless of the type of love, Achilles loved Patroclus deeply. He would not have reacted in such a way otherwise. Redefining this love as romantic is empowering to the queer community, as we are able to look back and see that we existed in history. Not only that, but our existence has been a long and epic one. The popularity of Achilles and Patroclus in a romantic context can be attributed to male homosexuality being a defining characteristic of ancient Greece. In particular, the activity of pederasty demonstrates that male homosexuality went beyond acceptance. It was a mode of empowerment. Pederasty was a sexual relationship between an older man and a younger man, a youth, known respectively as the Erastes and the Eromenos. It is a relationship of exchanged favors, as the Erastes receives sexual favors and a connection to the younger man's family in exchange for educating the youth. Beyond exploring and indulging in a sexual connection, both men can use this connection to advance their careers. This concept is perhaps best romanticized in the story of Harmodius and Aristogeiton, two lovers in a pederastic relationship who are emboldened to forcefully drive out tyranny in Athens. The story begins with Hipparchus, a tyrant of Athens in 514 BC. Hipparchus flirted with Harmodius, and Harmodius rejected him. Harmodius was the Eromenos in the relationship, and Aristogeiton was his Erastes. He then told Aristogeiton of Hipparchus' flirtations, and Aristogeiton was enraged. Hipparchus, in humiliation of Harmodius' rebuff of his flirtations, chose Harmodius' sister in a procession, and on the day decided she was unworthy of the role. In final retaliation, the pair plotted to kill Hipparchus for respectively insulting them. There has been debate regarding the true motivation of the lovers to assassinate the tyrant. Thucydides has asserted that they were not patriotically driven by ideals of democracy to rid Athens of tyranny, but rather to avenge the offense to their relationship. However, in Plato's Symposium, Plato himself commends the love of Harmodius and Aristogeiton. It is a lesson that our despots learned by experience, for Aristogeiton's love and Harmodius' friendship grew to be so steadfast that it wrecked their power. Plato's praise of the two lovers demonstrate how they were perceived. The governmental structure of Athens was always a defining feature of great importance for the prolific city-state. These two figures were lauded by later authors, such as Plato and Achilles, for their work in saving the city-state from tyranny. The fact that they were in a pederastic relationship demonstrates how homosexuality was celebrated. Now that we have established how pederasty was an important aspect to ancient Greek society, we can link how writers of antiquity would supplant this importance in literature, and we can see that it was supplanted in Achilles and Patroclus' relationship. The pair's relationship was a topic of discussion in Plato's Symposium, where Plato praises their love. Whereas Achilles, son of Thetis, they honored and sent to his place in the Isles of the Blessed, he bravely chose to go and rescue his lover Patroclus, avenged him, and sought death not merely in his behalf, but in haste to be joined with him whom death had taken. For this the gods so highly admired him, that they gave him distinguished honor, since he set so great a value on his lover. For in truth, there is no sort of valor more respected by the gods than this which comes of love. This quote reveals how valued their relationship was. Further, the specific dynamics of the pair's relationship was discussed in Plato's Symposium, where Phaedrus rejects Aeschylus' interpretation that Achilles was the Erastes and Patroclus was the Eromenos. As previously discussed, Homer did not explicitly define the love between Achilles and Patroclus as romantic. As Ascanius puts it, Homer avoids giving a name to their friendship. Therefore, Plato has written of his own interpretation of characters that differ from the source material, or, for our modern understanding, he has created a fan fiction of the Iliad. Fan fiction is very important to the LGBTQ+ community. In a world with a history where queer people are frequently omitted from stories, fan fiction is a way for us to insert ourselves or people like us into stories that we love. The ancient Greeks using this process to write how they see the relationship of Achilles and Patroclus demonstrates that their importance to the queer community has a historical basis. This is why male queer retellings are more prevalent and popular among modern audiences, as there is simply more concrete material that authors can use to make the retellings more authentic to the source material. It is a privilege for the queer community to read of two men who feel this epic love, and a story as cemented in the cultural psyche as the Iliad. However, there is not a substantial counterpart for queer women. In the context of analyzing queer female relationships in the Greek mythos that could be retold, there are a few examples to pull from. In lieu of finding explicit examples of female homosexuality, The last portion of my research will examine examples of female agency in connection to sexuality and desire, and how this could influence the insertion of a female queerness in the historical canon. The possibility of female pederasty is a notable example of female agency. The majority of research has been helmed by Julia Barclay, a recent graduate from the University of Guelph. There are mythical origins that indicate the existence of female pederasty, particularly the myth of Artemis, Zeus, and Callisto. Callisto was a maiden of Artemis, and Zeus assumes the disguise of his daughter to seduce her. When Zeus approaches Callisto in his disguise, she is pleased to see him, and only resisted when she realized that it was not Artemis before her. This myth is telling, as it indicates the type of common interactions that could have occurred between Artemis and her maidens. Expanding from the mythical sources, there is ample evidence explaining Artemis's function as a figure of worship for women, particularly in ceremonies of transition in young women's lives. The cult of Artemis at Lysosonos, meaning the belt or girdle loosener, was worshipped over the sexual evolution accompanied by marriage, as the belt represented her virginity, which Artemis would loosen upon intercourse. Further, another cult of Artemis, Artemis of Baronia, was worshipped as the protector of childbirth. We can see that the religion surrounding Artemis demonstrates that she was an important figure in young women's lives. This makes her our best mythological counterpart for the initiatory tradition of young girls into maidens. While the evidence available for the theory of female pederasty pales in comparison to what we know about male pederasty, it is emblematic of why female retellings do not have as much resonance. We do not know as much about female homosexual relations as male homosexual relations. Medea is a notable example of a character whose female agency is a retaliation to being restricted within the sanctioned gender roles of Greek society. Her expression of agency is comparable to queerness, as they have both been othered throughout society. Euripides' Medea opens after the quest for the Golden Fleece, and the nurse tells us how Jason abandoned Medea for Chryseia, the princess of Corinth. The consequences of this for Medea are grave, as her and her sons face expulsion from Corinth, a consequence made more serious considering that she is a foreigner. Aristotle holds in his Politics that anger is a natural reaction when familial philia is disrupted. This is the first tenet in explaining Medea's violent reaction to her betrayal. Jason severed his oath to Medea to advance his own name, as Chryseia was more socially revered in society than Medea. Marrying a princess over a foreigner would have undoubtedly elevated Jason's name to a better position. Medea is then confronted by her own inadequacy and feels anger because of it. The second tenet is a betrayal of hospitality through the rules of Xenia. Through her relationship with Jason, she was initially granted hospitality, but Jason's betrayal rendered this as null. Medea is forced to resort to her own means, as it is her speech to Creon that persuades him to let her stay. Rites of hospitality and honoring oaths of the oikos were valued more in antiquity. Medea experiences an injustice by the denial of her rights. According to Caesar, once these two relationships are disrespected by others through either betrayal within the private realm of the oikos or exclusion from public life of the polis, one cannot remain fully human. In this context, Medea is not a black and white villainess. She is a marginalized person living on the outskirts of society, fighting for the rights that she is entitled to. The killing of her children is her violent reaction to gain vengeance against the person who has denied her these rights. The following pieces of dialogue from Euripides' play further elucidates her betrayal and why she felt so compelled to gain vengeance against Jason. The first line is from the opening of the play, delivered by the nurse. Poor Medea, finding herself thus cast aside, calls loudly on his oaths, invokes the mighty assurance of his sworn right hand, and calls the gods to witness the unjust return she is getting from Jason. The second line is from Medea herself, and it expresses the raw anger she feels. I can no longer look at you, but am overwhelmed with my pain, and I know well what pain I am about to undergo. But my wrath overbears my calculation, wrath that brings mortal men their gravest hurt. These two pieces of dialogue from the play are very important for informing the audience of the anguish Medea feels. As explained above, she has suffered a horrible injustice, and these two pieces of dialogue creates empathy for her plight, even though we know she is going to do something abhorrent. It does not justify her actions, but it emphasizes her humanity. Her story has been retold, as Medea's identity as a foreigner and the betrayal she experiences allows modern authors to use her story to represent not only betrayed women, but also oppressed racial groups, exploited colonials. As mentioned in the beginning of my presentation, telling unheard stories from marginalized groups of people have become extremely important to our society. If one wants to tell stories of being marginalized or oppressed, Medea's anger is a powerful way to recontextualize that anger and these stories. One such example is the play The Hungry Woman, a Mexican Medea, which is about a queer Chicana woman exiled from her homeland because of her sexuality. This is a great example of illustrating the power mythology has to elevate stories of our era. It's not as easy as whimsically supplanting queerness on any character, but the emotions and betrayal she feels is comparable to the anguish felt as a queer individual or person of color when encountering prejudice. This leads me to the last portion of my research, which is discussing how the majority of queer female retellings has formed. Modern authors have simply added to the narrative by expanding on the scarcity of evidence of female homosexual agency. While this is the same method employed by Madeline Miller to create the Song of Achilles, the results are different as there is not as much evidence to work with. This is perhaps best exemplified with the popularity of Sappho as a queer icon, which is odd as we do not know a lot about her. However, this gap in the knowledge is exactly why she is so popular, as according to Susan Gabar, because so many of Sappho's work is destroyed, the modern woman could write for or as Sappho and thereby invent a classical inheritance of her own. The details of how modern authors can add to the narrative can be explained through Catherine Buettner's modern retelling of Alcestis, which is the inspiration for this presentation. Buettner's retelling is largely faithful to Euripides' tragedy, save for one deviation. Alcestis falls for Persephone when she enters the underworld. To provide a brief but necessary spoiler for the book, in an attempt to woo Alcestis, Persephone reveals in a speech that before she was abducted by Hades, she lived among maidens. The description of how they lived together is quite similar to how Artemis lived among her maidens in the myth of Callisto. No man shall have them, and no god either. The touch of a man would repulse them, for they have known my touch and kiss. The familiarity between Persephone and her maidens compares to the relationship between Artemis and her maidens. As I've already discussed, the myth of Callisto and Artemis indicates the type of interactions that could be commonplace between Artemis and her women. To expand, Callisto was about to accept whom she believed to be Artemis's intimacies, but she resisted when she learned it was Zeus in disguise. This passage recontextualizes the myth of Artemis and Callisto. It seems that Artemis would have acted similarly to Artemis if one of her maidens were to choose a man over herself. It is a harsh, cruel perspective, but she is a god, and the mythology has taught us that Greek deities were inherently cruel. However, the cruel possessiveness Artemis displays in the myths, and what Persephone displays in her retelling, is a devotion to protect her queerness. Artemis has declared herself as chaste to remain unmarried, and myths like Actaeon demonstrate that any male affection would be met with swift punishment. Buettner explicitly links the operation of Persephone's queerness to Artemis's queerness. In comparison to Achilles and Patroclus in the Song of Achilles, the entirety of Persephone's queer identity in Buettner's story rests on a theory of Artemis being queer. This disparity demonstrates why there is not as much resonance with queer male-field retellings when it is not explicitly linked to the historical canon. Implanting queerness in mythological stories can feel haphazard and unfamiliar. And so we've reached the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for listening. To quickly conclude, the Song of Achilles is one of the most well-known retellings of late because it utilized the established popularity of Achilles and Patroclus. Achilles and Patroclus were so popular because the ancient Greeks themselves believed that they were in a romantic relationship, thus strengthening the resonance of retelling their story for modern audiences. In contrast, female queer retellings has evolved in a piecemeal fashion, where certain aspects of antiquity have endured. These aspects, like the possibility of female pederasty or the accumulation of Sappho's identity as a queer icon, were mere traces on the historical record. Authors have rested entire retellings of female queer existence onto these traces, which is a reason for why they are not as popular among modern audiences. While this was not within the scope of my thesis, the marketability of gay men to gay women to mainstream audiences undoubtedly played a role in why the Song of Achilles is so popular. Queerness, however, has often not fit into the mainstream and has not always been marketable. The quote on the screen poetically encapsulates the ethos of my presentation. To read it off, "The story of my marriage," she said, her thumb skimming my collarbone, of my wedding. "The story no one knows, for the bards do not sing it, and the painters do not smear it on their walls. It is not fit for such audiences, but it is fit for you, Alcestis." For context, Persephone is telling Alcestis, a woman she has grown to love, of what her true story is. She tells her that other people would not have understood, for the bards do not sing it. Therefore, this quote not only demonstrates the otherness of female queerness in antiquity, but it also demonstrates how marginalized representation finds the most resonance with who they are representing. And yeah, that's the end. Thank you so much for listening.